So we observe that not only inflation has increased, but inflation has reached like very high levels in some countries in the region. I mean, you guys know which countries they are, so I don't need to tell you that. And in 2023, we're expecting that number of countries will decrease to about 12. No? So there's going to be disinflation in some countries, of course. Next, please. The third driver of the performance of the region is tightened global financial conditions. No? As we saw, inflation in advanced countries, you have that inflation in the United States, in the euro area, France, Germany, and the UK it basically protractedly increased in 2022, and by the end of the year, it appears to have reached some sort of peak. Unfortunately, inflation is falling at a very slow pace. So there's some stickiness in the trajectory towards the decline. In response to this rising inflation, central banks in advanced countries have rapidly and sizably increased rates. If you look at the first graph and you look at the red line, you will see the adjustment of the interest rates of G7 countries in response to rising inflation. And if you look at that trend, basically the dotted red line is very similar in trajectory to two massive adjustments that the U.S. had, that the G7 monetary policies and U.S. monetary policy had. One, December 72, which is pretty much associated to the first oil price crisis, and the second one by mid-79, which is the big U.S. inflationary period during the Carter administration. The problem with rising rates is that rising rates in advanced countries is going to have an impact on countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Rising interest rates is going to lead to flows of capital out of the continent. It would increase sovereign spreads, it would weaken the currencies, and it will make external borrowing more costly. Next one, please. The fourth factor is high levels of debt. As you know, I mean, this is not a new story, unfortunately. And if you look at that graph, you'll see that over the last 12 years, public debt in sub-Saharan Africa has tripled. No? So it has increased 3 times, and the increase in debt was prior to the pandemic. No? On the contrary, during the pandemic it has also grown, but it hasn't grown at a rate that it grew before. Now, there are 2 things that are happening with debt that are very different from any other episode of increasing debt in the continent. One is that there has been some shift within public debt towards more domestic debt. So countries are basically issuing more domestic securities, to the extent that by the end of 2021, half of the public debt of African countries were in domestic debt. We're talking about averages here, of course. There's going to be differences across countries. And the second factor is that within external debt, there has been a change in the landscape of creditors. If we start thinking about the HIPIC or we start thinking about the MDRI, most of the creditors in sub-Saharan Africa were multilaterals or the Paris Club. Now we have a different set of creditors, including, for instance, private creditors, whether it has been African countries issuing bonds or receiving market-based lending, or new governments, like, for instance, China, India, Turkey, etc. No? This more heterogeneous landscape of creditors it has, to some extent, created some problems right now in terms of debt resolution, but we're going to go through that. The other thing that has happened with debt in Africa is that concessional lending has declined. And as concessional lending has declined and African countries are resorting to costlier ways of borrowing, of course, debt services is going to rise. On average, at this point, by 2021, yeah, I think it's 2021, as a percentage of government revenues, debt service is 40%, which is big. And we're talking, this is the average. So we're not talking about countries like Ghana or Nigeria where that proportion is even bigger. And the bigger that proportion, the less funds the government has to finance other developmental issues. Next. So what are the policy recommendations to this outlook that we presented in the polls? And here I'm going to try to be brief because I need to let Jim talk a little bit. As we said before, global growth is going to be subdued. It's not going to be too high. You know, global from advanced countries is going to be 0.7 this year, 1.2% next year. So we assume that the global engine of growth that was fueling African countries is going to be subdued. So in that context, African countries need to resort more on regional engines of growth, engaging in trade with countries in the continent, and also in domestic engines of growth. And this is where African policymakers must rely on their domestic policy space. In order to restore macro stability, in this context is try to control inflation, ensures the independence of the central bank in terms of independence from the political process and independence in terms of the instruments that we will use to stabilize prices, try to support institutions that put a premium on transparency and accountability in monetary policy, trying to have a fiscal policy that is anchored on debt sustainability. It's work for the international community to try to improve methods of debt resolution, because Africa needs to have, some African countries really need to have some debt restructuring. The second aspect is deepen structural reforms to foster inclusive growth, and this has to do with policies to bolster investment. Investment is needed in Africa. Private sector investment is needed in Africa. So policies that bolster investment, policies that improve competitiveness, whether it's trade policies, FDI policies, leveraging from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, strengthening institutions that promote competition, and also attracting FDI is very important. It's essential for Africa to grow. And finally, and this is where I'm going to leave the mic to Jim, seize the opportunities available during the low carbon transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cesar. If we could have the next slide, please. So, my name is James Cust. I work in the Africa region with Cesar, and our office puts out this report every 6 months to update the macroeconomic outlook, as you've just seen from the first few slides we presented. But each time we put out a new report, we pick a special topic. And the special topic is guided by what the rising issues in the region are, and things that we think are important to bring to the attention of policymakers and the private sector and others. So the topic we chose for this issue of Africa's Pulse is the opportunity created by the low carbon transition. And so this is what I'm going to speak about for a moment here. So we see two main areas in which the low carbon transition presents an opportunity for Africa. We hear a lot of talk about climate change, and of course we know that many of the impacts of climate change are going to fall disproportionately on African economies. But there's another side to this story, and the other side to this story relates to the natural resource wealth that many African economies have. So if we can go to the next slide. So this gives you a snapshot of the concentration of both fossil fuel wealth and mineral wealth across the sub-Saharan African region. And there's two things I want to point out. One is that we already knew that there is great resource abundance under the ground in many countries across sub-Saharan Africa. But the other important thing to realize is that many of these countries have been relatively underexplored compared to the rest of the world. And so it's not just that there are a lot of reserves yet to be exploited, but there are actually even more reserves that we're still discovering. So the last 20 years, for example, most of the giant oil and gas discoveries have taken place in sub-Saharan Africa more than any other region in the world. The chart on the right shows a similar picture for some key mineral reserves and how they've been increasing in abundance over the last few years. Now, what's notable about these minerals is that they're going to be particularly important for driving the low-carbon transition. So as the world begins to decarbonize, this is going to involve an accelerating shift towards renewable energy technologies, to electric vehicles, to batteries. We're going to be increasingly reliant on battery technology for energy storage, and other kinds of electronics. And it turns out that many of the minerals and metals that are needed to drive this low-carbon transition are found in abundance across the sub-Saharan African region. So the question is, how can we turn this abundance into genuine economic transformation above the ground? And this is what we discuss in detail in this new report. If we go to the next slide. So I'm just going to give you a few highlights of some of the things that we've looked at. The first one is the fiscal opportunity. So the chart here shows the proportion of government revenues that are currently being collected from natural resources in each country as a share of the estimated rents associated with those natural resources. And basically what we find is that governments could be capturing even more money from natural resources as government revenues than they're currently doing. We put the overall regional estimate at 40%, meaning government revenues represent only 40% of the potential that they could capture in terms of economic rents coming from resource exploitation. And of course, this is before we even take into account new deposits that are being discovered all the time and the opportunity that countries have to attract investment, to build mines, to expand mines, and to increase the government revenue coming from this. So firstly, we have a fiscal opportunity. On top of that, we have this flurry of new discoveries that has already been taking place over the last 20 years, many of which are moving forward only quite slowly towards getting the necessary investment to be exploited. We see a big opportunity in strengthening the fiscal administration so that governments today can start boosting the revenues that they're capturing from these projects and do so in a way that doesn't deter future investment in the sector. There's a very particular opportunity around fossil fuels, which is that because we see that there has been under taxation or under capture of the rents available from fossil fuels, that governments actually have an opportunity not just to increase the revenues, but to decrease the implicit production subsidy that's provided to the sector. And so this would be good not just for people, because it would free up more government revenues for development priorities, but it would also be good for the planet. We can go to the next slide, please. The other opportunity that we explore relating to the low-carbon transition is the one presented by regional integration. So we've seen the high-level political will put behind the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and we see this holding extreme potential for improving the value addition that we see from natural resource sectors. However, the starting point is one where many countries have a very nationally oriented approach to the extractive industry sectors, and there are many restrictions on regional trade and regional integration that would need to be unlocked before the real economic potential can be realized. Now, we have reasons for optimism. So we're starting to see already regional cooperation emerging. So the most recent news that many of you will have seen was an MOU signed between the DRC, Zambia, and the United States around battery minerals. And here the recognition is that both Zambia and DRC have many of the metals that are going to be very important in the next generation of battery technologies. But they don't necessarily have all of the capital and the technology that they need to build out this value chain. And as we know, there are many small markets spread across Africa that on their own may not have the access to capital, may not have the technology, may not have the capabilities to do it all on their own. And so this is where we see regional integration as being really important, and we're hopeful that this is the beginning of more examples of this kind of regional cooperation that could unlock this value. So I'm going to stop there, but we're very happy to take your questions, and thank you very much.
One more time, a big one for these wonderful gentlemen. Yes, we're going to have questions. But before we do that, hungry people don't listen. Because if you're hungry, you can't listen to anything. So what I would like to ask Mr. President and the chairman and everybody else, let us go and serve food first, take a break, digest what you have gotten, and digest your food, and then we ask questions. Professor Jeremiah here will lead the questions. Ben Kasue, Ben, you'll be there. Ed Alex and Catherine are ready for your questions. 2, we've got quite a number of questions from online people all over the world, and they're tough questions. We'll ask them, but why don't we eat first? Is that okay, Mr. President? Okay, let's go and serve our food, please, and then we come back. We continue the World Bank. Mr. President, please.
Thank you very much, the World Bank team, for your presentation. So at this point, we want to acknowledge we have visiting members of Kenyan Parliament and also senators of Kenya. We, in the spirit of being the hosts, we let them be the first on the line to the buffet.
Why don't they mention their names so that we know them?
I think there is a session for them here where we'll be able to acknowledge all of them, each one of them. But since it's lunchtime, let us just first.
First, then we get to know them.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Thank you. Karibuni, our members of parliament and senators. The food is ready. Please eat. We'll introduce each one of you in the next session before our team from the World Bank answers the questions. Thank you so much. Even for you, you'll have to eat first.
The team of the World Bank, please, you guys, my God, Caesar.
Yeah.
James, you guys eat fast, put some food. You know, people want to, because they're not
And we will be asking the questions to the World Bank team as people are eating, so these are going to be ongoing things. So over to you, Daktari Ongaki.